The African heat was merciless. A prisoner lay confined, his captors having devised torments that would echo through centuries. Sleep became impossible. His body bore wounds that multiplied with every slight movement. The torture was methodical, designed not for quick execution but for maximum suffering stretched across days. According to Roman accounts, his tormentors denied him even the mercy of closing his eyes, exposing him to relentless sunlight until his vision failed. Every hour brought fresh agony in a cycle that seemed without end. This was no accident of war. This was the fate Marcus Atilius Regulus chose for himself. The Roman consul had stood in his own city, free with his family, pleading for him to stay. Yet he boarded a ship back to Carthage, knowing full well what awaited him. His captors had released him temporarily on a mission of diplomacy, bound only by his sworn oath to return if negotiations failed. When he deliberately sabotaged those very negotiations, speaking against peace in the Roman Senate, he sealed his own doom. His name would become legendary not for military victories but for a decision that still puzzles historians. Why would any person voluntarily embrace such a fate? The answer lies in understanding Roman concepts of honor that bordered on fanaticism, where breaking your word was considered worse than the most excruciating death. By the 200s BC, two powers dominated the Mediterranean world, and their rivalry had reached a breaking point. Carthage controlled vital sea routes and commercial networks built over centuries. Rome possessed formidable land armies and an aggressive expansionist vision. Neither could tolerate the other's continued dominance. The resulting conflict, known as the First Punic War, would determine who ruled the central Mediterranean for generations to come. The fighting had already consumed years and countless lives when Marcus Atilius Regulus rose to prominence. A veteran politician who had served as consul twice, Regulus brought military experience and absolute confidence to every campaign. His record showed no major defeats. More importantly, he possessed the kind of aggressive temperament Rome valued in its commanders. Where cautious generals saw risk, Regulus saw opportunity. This boldness would propel him to extraordinary heights and ultimately doom him to an unthinkable fate. Regulus miscalculated badly in 256 BC, though at the time it seemed impossible. His invasion force had achieved what many Romans thought unattainable. The expedition landed directly on North African soil, threatening Carthage itself. A massive naval engagement off Cape Ecnomus resulted in Carthaginian defeat, one of the largest fleet battles the ancient world had witnessed. Roman soldiers then marched inland, destroying settlements and capturing territory. Carthaginian leaders, watching their heartland burn, approached Regulus with terms for ending hostilities. This moment required diplomatic skill and strategic thinking. Instead, Regulus presented demands so extreme they left Carthage no honorable option but continued resistance. He wanted their complete subjugation, terms that would reduce a major power to a vassal state. What Regulus failed to grasp was that cornered enemies often fight with desperate intensity. By refusing reasonable settlement, he inadvertently unified Carthaginian resolve. They would soon hire foreign military expertise that would transform their fortunes completely. His moment of greatest triumph contained the seeds of catastrophic reversal. Facing imminent defeat, Carthage hired a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus to salvage their military situation. His assessment was immediate and damning. Carthaginian forces had been fighting in mountainous regions where their primary advantages, cavalry and war elephants, provided little benefit. This tactical blunder had cost them numerous battles against Roman infantry. Xanthippus relocated operations to open plains and retrained the demoralized troops. Within weeks, he transformed a broken army into a coordinated fighting force positioned on terrain that favored their strengths. Regulus, meanwhile, remained overconfident from his earlier victories. He saw Carthaginian forces moving to flat ground and interpreted it as desperation rather than strategy. The Roman general believed he faced the same defeated enemy. He was catastrophically wrong. Xanthippus had engineered the perfect killing field. The battle unfolded exactly as Xanthippus had planned. Carthaginian war elephants, roughly 100 of them, charged the Roman center before infantry engagement could begin. Roman legionaries had trained for fighting other soldiers, not massive animals capable of trampling entire ranks. The formation buckled under the assault. Xanthippus exploited this chaos perfectly. While Roman troops struggled against the elephant charge, Carthaginian cavalry swept around both flanks across the open terrain. The encirclement was swift and complete. Roman soldiers found themselves surrounded with no line of retreat available. What began as a conventional battle became systematic destruction. The casualty figures tell the story. Of approximately 30,000 Roman troops, only 2,000 escaped. The remainder died on the field or fell into Carthaginian hands as prisoners. Among the captured was Regulus himself. The consul who had demanded Carthage's total submission now stood in chains before Carthaginian leaders. His invasion of Africa had collapsed entirely. The next 5 years would pass in a North African prison cell while the war continued without him. Regulus remained imprisoned in Carthage for 5 years while the war stalemated. Neither Rome nor Carthage could gain decisive advantage, and the fighting dragged on with mounting casualties on both sides. Carthaginian leaders eventually devised a strategy to break the deadlock. They would release Regulus temporarily to negotiate a prisoner exchange in Rome. The plan depended on Roman concepts of honor. Carthage made Regulus swear an oath that he would return to captivity if negotiations failed. They believed a Roman noble would consider such an oath unbreakable, even if it meant certain death. This assumption would prove both correct and catastrophic. The war's prolonged stalemate created conditions for unusual diplomacy. Carthage proposed using Regulus himself as their negotiator, sending him back to Rome with terms for peace and a prisoner exchange. Both sides held valuable captives. Rome had several young Carthaginian officers crucial to future campaigns. Carthage imprisoned hundreds of Roman nobles whose families wanted them returned. The entire scheme hinged on exploiting Roman cultural values. Before releasing Regulus, Carthaginian leaders required him to swear a binding oath invoking both Roman and Carthaginian deities. The terms were explicit. If the Senate rejected the proposal, Regulus must voluntarily return to Carthage and resume his imprisonment. To modern observers, this seems absurd. Why would anyone honor such a promise? But Carthage understood that for traditional Roman aristocrats, breaking a sacred vow represented ultimate dishonor, worse than any physical suffering. They gambled that Regulus would choose death over shame. The calculation would prove devastatingly accurate. When Regulus arrived in Rome, citizens barely recognized the gaunt figure in prisoner's garments. 5 years of captivity had transformed the once vigorous consul into a broken man. He refused familial embraces and declined to enter the Senate chamber as a member, insisting he remain technically a Carthaginian captive bound by oath. The Senate granted him audience to present Carthage's proposal. Everyone expected Regulus would advocate for the prisoner exchange that would secure his freedom and that of hundreds of other Romans. Instead, he methodically argued against acceptance. His reasoning was coldly strategic. The Carthaginian officers held by Rome were young, experienced commanders essential to their enemy's military future. The Roman prisoners in Carthage, including himself, were older men whose battlefield value had diminished. Trading fresh enemy talent for exhausted Roman veterans made no strategic sense. His moral argument proved even more compelling. Allowing captured soldiers to return home would establish a dangerous precedent, suggesting that surrender carried acceptable consequences. Roman military discipline depended on the absolute expectation that soldiers would fight to the death rather than submit. The Senate, swayed by his logic and shamed by his willingness to sacrifice himself, voted down the proposal. The war would continue. Regulus had deliberately ensured his mission's failure, knowing exactly what awaited him in Carthage. Roman law offered Regulus a clear escape. Oaths made under captivity carried no legal weight, and senators publicly stated this. His family begged him to stay. He refused every argument and returned to Carthage, prioritizing his personal interpretation of honor over survival or legal precedent. Carthaginian leaders learned of the Senate's rejection before Regulus arrived. Their reaction was pure fury. The diplomatic gambit had backfired catastrophically. They had released their most valuable prisoner, expecting him to secure peace. And instead, he had sabotaged their proposal and rekindled Roman fighting spirit. The fact that he now voluntarily returned to their control only deepened the humiliation. Vengeance, not respect, awaited him. Not respect. The historical record here becomes deeply problematic. Only Roman sources describe what happened to Regulus after his return, and they wrote these accounts decades or centuries after the events. No Carthaginian records survive to confirm or deny the claims. Modern historians face a fundamental question. Are these descriptions of actual events or wartime propaganda designed to demonize Rome's enemy? The Roman accounts claim Carthaginian captors subjected Regulus to elaborate, prolonged torture. One version describes his eyelids being removed, followed by alternating periods of total darkness and forced exposure to bright sunlight, a method intended to destroy his vision and mental stability. The most famous element involves a wooden container lined with sharp spikes. According to these sources, Regulus was confined inside where any movement caused injury, leading to a slow, agonizing death. These narratives served clear political purposes for Rome. They provided moral justification for continued warfare and eventual total destruction of Carthage. The story of Regulus suffering heroically while barbaric enemies inflicted unthinkable cruelty became a powerful propaganda tool. Whether the torture occurred as described in some modified form or was largely invented remains historically uncertain. The legend itself, regardless of literal accuracy, shaped Roman identity and foreign policy for generations. Roman accounts describe a brutal public execution. Sources claim Regulus was confined in a spiked container that was then pushed down a hill, with some versions adding boiling liquid poured over it. These details come primarily from Diodorus Siculus, writing 2 centuries later. Earlier historian Polybius simply states Regulus died in captivity without mentioning torture. The discrepancy suggests embellishment. Whether the extreme torture occurred as described or Romans invented details to vilify their enemy, the propaganda value was immense. The story of Regulus's martyrdom provided moral justification for Rome's eventual total destruction of Carthage. His legend became more strategically important than his actual military career, transforming a failed general into the perfect symbol of Roman virtue and Carthaginian barbarism. Rome responded violently to news of Regulus's death. The Senate delivered 2 Carthaginian prisoners to his widow, Marcia, who, according to Diodorus Siculus, killed them through deliberate starvation and abuse. The account's accuracy is questionable, but illustrates how deeply personal the conflict had become. Regulus's cultural impact exceeded his military achievements. Roman society elevated him into an ideal of citizenship, with poets like Horace celebrating his sacrifice and schools teaching his story to children. The narrative reinforced discipline and provided moral justification for increasingly aggressive policies toward Carthage. His legend became propaganda supporting eventual calls for Carthage's complete destruction. In death, he served Rome more effectively than he ever had as a living general. The torture accounts are historically dubious. Diodorus Siculus provided detailed descriptions 2 centuries after the events, while Polybius, writing closer to the actual war, mentioned only that Regulus died in captivity without describing torture. This gap suggests embellishment or invention. The costly First Punic War required propaganda justifying continued sacrifice. The Regulus legend provided the perfect narrative. Roman heroism versus Carthaginian barbarism. Whether accurate or fabricated, the story dehumanized Rome's enemy and transformed strategic conflict into moral crusade. It ultimately justified Cato's campaign for Carthage's complete destruction, which Rome accomplished by razing the city entirely. The legend's propaganda value exceeded any historical truth, proving stories can be more dangerous than facts. The torture's historical accuracy matters less than the legend's impact. Regulus voluntarily returned to captivity and death rather than break his oath, a choice that became foundational to Roman identity. Rome transformed this narrative into powerful propaganda, justifying warfare and ultimately Carthage's complete destruction. His story raises timeless questions. When does principled duty become dangerous fanaticism? What price is too high for honor? Regulus offers no easy answers. Whether viewed as heroic martyr or cautionary tale about absolutism depends on how we weigh honor against human cost. His legend demonstrates that stories, regardless of factual truth, can shape civilizations and justify both noble sacrifice and genocidal violence. The real price of duty may be measured not in individual suffering, but in how societies exploit such sacrifice for their own ends.